Well, testing didn't go as expected. All right. So, as you guys know, I set out to do my VO2max test and then a follow-up 5-1 assessment, and I am not pleased with the results, but not in the way that you'd think. So, I spent all this time, going down to the rec center on campus, getting a treadmill set up, all that sort of stuff, getting all my gear set up. And when I finally got done, I realized that the metabolic device that I was using, the VO2 Master, was not actually recording my VO2. This was during both my 5-1 test and during my VO2 max test. So I'm not going to be able to give all of you numbers on my VO2 max or how my VO2 max changed over time during my 5-1 assessment. But I will be able to still analyze my respiratory variables like respiratory frequency, tidal volume, ventilation or minute ventilation, which is in liters per minute. And I'll also be able to show you kind of what happened with my heart rate, my core body temperature, and 3 sites of near-infrared spectroscopy. While I am disappointed in not being able to measure my VO2, we're going to make lemonade out of lemons here, and we're still going to be able to glean a lot of good information from the 2 tests. So what I want to do now is talk about the maximal exercise test first, and then in follow-up video I'll talk about the 5-1 assessment, limiter assessment that I did. So let's just kind of jump into it. So just as a recap, I did both my tests on a treadmill, and my goal was to essentially power hike as long as possible, to as steep of an incline as possible, and then jog and then run after that. So the VO2 max test was as follows. I actually did it after my 5-1 assessment because I wanted to be warmed up first. But the VO2 max test, I started with 5 minutes at a 5% incline and 5 miles an hour. 5 miles an hour is a very light jogging pace for me. And I wanted to just see what my heart rate and what my other variables would be just at a very, very light jog. This is also wanting to compare my hiking speed, which I did a lot of during the 5-1 test, to my jogging speed. And what's really interesting is that just the change from hiking at like 4 miles an hour-ish at a 10% grade, my heart rate only got up to like 110 beats per minute. But as soon as I started jogging, my heart rate moved up to about 130 beats per minute. So for all of you out there, that's fairly normal in terms of the physiological response. Running just is a much larger demand on the cardiovascular system, so heart rate is going to go up, and this just highlights the need for walking where you need to, and then running where it's appropriate during different races. So I am certainly going to be utilizing the power hiking on a lot of the uphills during my ultra marathon race, and just during training and that sort of stuff. Started at 5 miles an hour, 5% incline, and then I increased 1 mile an hour every 3 minutes after the first 5 minutes. So I'll make a little graph that I can overlay on this, but essentially it was a 3-minute step test where I would do 3 minutes of work, and then I would move up 1 mile an hour to the next load. And I didn't get very far because my running shape is still pretty bad. But at a 5% incline, roll back. So it wasn't 1 mile an hour increase. It was a 0.5 mile an hour increase every 3 minutes. And I didn't get very far, but what I realized is that half a mile an hour increase wasn't very much in terms of challenging my physiology. It was like very, very incremental, and doing that for 3 minutes, I was already pretty tired. So what I decided to do for the last couple of steps was increase my incline 2 degrees per step. So I went from 5 to 7, and then to 9, and then pretty much tapped out after that. So like I said, I'll put a little graph with the incline and the speed on an overlay here. But let's dive into the actual analysis of the VO2max test. Like I said, I don't actually have VO2max, but I have a high heart rate that I did measure, and then I have the SMO2 response and the heart rate response. So hopefully we can glean some good information out of that. All right, so here we have a graph of the heart rate response in red and SMO2 response in blue. And remember, this is during the step test where we go from about 5 miles an hour running and then bump up speed just a little bit. So it goes from 5 to 6 to 7, and then we start bumping up the incline as well. So what I'm looking for when I analyze these graphs are first, well, if we had VO2max, then we would look at where VO2 was plateauing and other things like that. But since we don't have that, we can get we can actually get 4 important points here. We can get threshold 1, we can get threshold 2, and then we can get minimum SMO2 and maximum heart rate. So I already put threshold 1 on here, and threshold 1 is generally determined as the first point where SMO2 starts to change, say flat to down to even more steeply down. So threshold 1 I've determined at this inflection point right here, where SMO2 is around 47 and heart rate is around 142. And then if we look further down, there's another inflection point down here where I'm going to put this next circle. So this inflection point right here, where SMO2 starts to drop even more rapidly, is similar to threshold 2. So if you were ever doing anything like lactate testing or ventilatory threshold testing, these thresholds that are determined by NIRS have been shown to be pretty closely related to lactate and ventilatory thresholds. But if you look in the literature, there is some variability depending on methodology that you use to measure things. But the bottom line is that we're just trying to estimate points where your body is homeostatic, or the disturbance in homeostasis is changing. So threshold 1, essentially anything under threshold 1, your body is able to reestablish oxygen and physiological homeostasis really, really well. Between threshold 1 and threshold 2, your body is still able to reestablish some level of homeostasis. It just requires a higher level of oxygen utilization. And then from threshold 2 onward, there's essentially just an ever decreasing SMO2 because your body is continually trying to use more and more oxygen compared to what it can deliver. And eventually you get to a low point in your SMO2. And that is, if you hit a low point in your SMO2, you're generally going to fail pretty soon after that. So we can see with this final step that my SMO2 kind of gets to a low point and then kind of plateaus out at around 7% or so. And with a max heart rate around, let's see where the max heart rate is. I always like to draw these lines just so I can draw them up. But with a max heart rate of around 174. So now we know, at least on a treadmill running at a pretty steep incline, that my max heart rate is around 174. Move that up. My minimum SMO2 min is around 7. And this, I should mention that this was measured in my calf muscle, so my gastroc, the big, the larger head of the gastroc. And I see generally a more pronounced desaturation when I'm running in my gastroc compared to like my vastus lateralis or my rectus femoris. So overall, what we're seeing here is we can identify threshold 1, we can identify threshold 2, we can identify max heart rate and minimum SMO2, and all of these will inform us on how we can train a little bit more effectively. So for example, if I was going to go out for a run and I wasn't wearing a Moxy, I would try to target heart rates that are lower than 142. And that may seem like really high, but my running heart rates are always super high, or at least they were in the beginning of my training cycle. For zone 2, we would want to keep that heart rate probably around 159, maybe a little bit higher if we're trying to do like VO2max intervals or other things like that. If we're trying to do something a little bit more threshold style, we would keep it on the other side of that. We would keep it probably 155 or so. And then we truly know we're screwing up, especially in an ultra endurance race, if we're hitting SMO2 values of 7 and max heart rates of 174. So even though I made a video that said it's probably not necessary to measure VO2max, I still think it's valuable to do something like a ramp test or a regular ramp test just to see where those maximal variables are. And they can help you certainly get a better idea of where your different zones are and how to physiologically calibrate each of your training days to whatever zone that you're supposed to be training in. The next video that I'm going to make is an analysis of my 5-1 assessment, where I'll show everybody how to actually derive different thresholds from that, as well as derive the greatest limiting physiological factor. If you guys are liking these videos, go ahead and give the video a like right now. And if you want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. All right, I'll catch you guys later.